So today we're really excited to have Juliet visiting with us. She is a writer. She's been working on the Mayflower A Sea of Change for the past several years with the most in-depth research on the Mayflower that I've seen as of yet. It's pretty amazing, the project that they've been working on. But we wanted to bring her on today to kind of talk about some of the family lines and the history of some of those families to kind of understand who these people were and why they decided to come to America, and have her fill in some of the gaps that we've been missing. So thank you for coming on today, Juliet. This is Cindy, our genetic genealogist.
Nice to meet you, Cindy.
So I guess we'll just jump right in. So why did you decide to do this?
Okay, well, I guess it's interesting that we had a pandemic 400 years ago that cleared America, the Great Dying, and we ended 400 years later at the anniversary of 2020, which is 400 years on. We started with another pandemic, so it's kind of interesting, and there's lots and lots of things that are quite similar actually when you start to look at it. But I guess our interest is what happened to that boat? What happened to those people? What were they really about? Were they just people who wanted religious freedom, a change of scene? They didn't like, for example, one of your questions was quite interesting. They didn't like the fact if they didn't go to church, they got fined. And then if they still didn't go to church, they got arrested and put in prison. So that's a very good reason to leave the country, I feel. So, but what's interesting about the Mayflower, I think what's intrigued people is that it was 102 people that were not men. They weren't Captain Cook going over to explore the Americas. They were going there to relocate. And I like to call it a Trojan horse, because women and children are a great smokescreen for what I think was really going on.
Oh, so what do you think was really going on?
I think that because £7,000 was spent on sending merchant adventurers over, so half of them, the people were separatists and pilgrims. They've been renamed at different stages of history, but they weren't all religious. Some of them weren't religious at all. In fact, that's where the word foreigner comes from, because some of them were not religious. Some of them were merchant adventurers from the Plymouth and London Company that were looking at opportunities for clearing land, making new businesses, I guess the beginning of colonization. So they weren't there all because they hated the situation here. Some of them were going for different reasons. And I think the previous boats that had gone had failed because they were pushed away by the Wampanoags. And so as a result, they needed to send a boat which was going to be acceptable to the Indian communities. And certainly women and children, people don't like to be shooting, killing. In those days there weren't guns, but they'd be using bows and arrows on women and children. So they felt that that would be a good wall to get them into the country. And it succeeded, actually. That is exactly what happened. Half the people died that terrible winter, and the other half were actually helped. And if they hadn't been helped by the local people, they would not have survived, and we would not be having this discussion today.
Yeah, I mean, the climate that I don't think they realized what they were walking into Massachusetts or into Plymouth under those circumstances, with the treacherous conditions they were walking into.
They were very brave, I think, first of all, the people who went on this boat, because it was, by the time they left, the height of winter. So they really, not only did they take on a challenge, but they took it on in winter, which, as you know, can be very brutal in America. But I think what is fascinating about the families that went is that they had loads of different professions. So they were ready to set up a community. It wasn't like, if you look at them, there were barrel makers, coopers, which is John Alden. You asked me about different names. There was fustian weavers. I'm sure you know how to do a bit of fustian work out there, which they cut the threads of the cloth. We had people who built the boats. We had wool combers, carpenters. Francis Eaton was a carpenter, and he was somebody who was good at building boats. But the people who built the boats built the houses. People talk about early architecture, but it was the boat builders who were the early architects. You had blacksmiths, because that's really important. You had doctors. You had journalists. I would say, almost argue that the Plymouth Plantation, written by William Bradford, was the earliest form of, journalism in terms of documenting daily life and what happened. And you had, of course, Stephen Hopkins, which is your family, making the shoes. And you had salters because, of course, there was no refrigeration. So they were carrying animals on board. And, you know, one of the shocking things I found is almost everybody, including the children, of which there were lots of children on this boat, were drinking alcohol because after a couple of weeks, the water goes dank and moldy in a barrel. So they were filling it with alcohol to keep it from going off. So everybody was drinking. And the only reason that changed in the 1920s is because they finally got, you know, kitchens on board. They were able to boil water, keep it in distilled canisters and stuff. But up until then, you know, traveling meant you took your cows, your sheep, and when you wanted to eat, you killed one.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't look very happy about that.
Well, I've done a lot of transatlantic. I've done 2 transatlantic boat cruises, you know, in the most comfort way possible. But you know, my father came over on a boat from Italy, you know, in the 40s, and the stories that they tell in the 40s are horrible. What went on in those boats? So I can only imagine coming over on the Mayflower how awful the conditions.
This boat was tiny. It was 100 foot. It had no windows. It had no toilets. They had just bowls that they would pee in, and these bowls would be moving around because it was very stormy. And you know, you had 102 people crammed in together. They didn't change their clothes. They couldn't bath. So you can imagine the stench, the rats, the horribleness of the storm. I mean, this was a very, it's amazing they made it, and there were 2 people who were pregnant on board. In fact, one pilgrim gave birth to a baby, and you just think, how did they do that in those circumstances?
It's incredible. All right, so going to some of the family lines, because we're kind of trying to figure out who were these family lines, what were they doing, what was their background, to kind of understand if we can put some of the pieces together of Cindy's research, where she's been able to. Well, Cindy, why don't you tell Juliet what you've come up with?
So I'm a genetic genealogist, and as a fun project, I built started building off serial killer family trees to see if some of them were related to a friend of mine. She's very much into serial killers, that lifestyle, which is fine. And then I noticed a pattern emerging. The Fuller line kept coming up, and then I was like, let me add another killer, and the Fuller line would come up again. The Fuller line is very, there are 12 serial killers that descend from the Fuller line. So there's definitely something interesting there. All but 6 of the families that left descendants have no serial killers. The rest of them all have serial killer attachments. Some might be 1 or 2 serial killers, but there are some lines that are a lot heavier. The Cook line, the Fuller line, Alden line, and so on and so forth. So I'm just looking at it like, why is it? And realistically, if you take pedigree collapse into consideration, the amount of descendants might be 0.9% of the population. So the estimate is 30 million, but with pedigree collapse into consideration, it's probably like 3 million realistic descendants of the Mayflower. So I was like, that's like 40% of the serial killers in the tree that are descending from these guys. Why is that? What is up with this weird connection that they have to the Mayflower? What went on? Why did they come over? You know, there's some sort of a mystery there, I'm sure, to be solved.
So I'm going to just put up
I think that's really, really interesting, because you see patterns. You see in the UK, families who sexually abuse go from one generation to the next. You see criminals go, and you know, they used to say it was the size of your brain. Well, it isn't. We now know from trauma counseling that it's if you have, and it's very interesting in Asia. If you have something go wrong in your life, like you see somebody killed on a train, either of you, you that might reenact it depending on your age, or you might become very damaged by it and end up being very depressed or whatever. They can spot it and they can cure it. If it's like maybe second generation, you knew your grandfather did something and it's passed on to you, can track it. If it goes back multiple generations, and this is what Ayurvedic doctors say, and even my father is in the law, you can't track it, you can't fix it. These people are fundamentally damaged, and it's almost passed on. And it's not passed on by telling a story. It's passed on by the way you live your life, because we all live our lives differently. But there will be ways of behaving, like pushing your child downstairs because you think that's normal. So you push your child downstairs. So it's behaviors that are being passed on with no original record of why that happened. So it doesn't surprise me that people came over on this boat in very, very traumatic circumstances had to survive with warships following, that people are descendants ended up being serial killers. I think that we will probably find there, with all the trauma and stuff we're looking at, and you've done more on crime than I have, that there will be patterns, and you'll start to see what they are, particularly if you can find the most recent members of the family. Those patterns, there will be residuals of them, and if you're a good detective, you'll be able to work out how that works.
Yeah, that's what we've been trying to sort through. So that's why we wanted to kind of get a little bit of a background on some of these families. I mean, you can start with my family, because we're not here to disparage the Mayflower people and their family lines. We're trying to understand this, and we'll just start with the Hopkins since I'm related to them. And I'm trying to get the tree up here. Give me 1 second. It just flipped. It's just not.
Yeah, I saw it was flipped. It needs to be flipped. So I mean, the Hopkins, I there's bits and pieces that I picked up. Like they make shoes. Also, Elizabeth was pregnant on the voyage. She gave birth to a son, Oceanus, which is quite nice.
Mm-hmm.
So a baby was born, a Mayflower baby in your family. I think the Hopkins were people who were trying to get land, trying to set up a colony. I don't feel that there were any sort of suggestions that they were going around causing trouble. I'd have to look at the compact to see if they were one of the 41 to sign it. Do you know, Cindy?
They
were one of the 41. So I don't know if you know much about the compact, but that was setting up rules, ways of behaving, and actually had a lot of religious things in there that you would cooperate and work with the local community if you came across them. So it wasn't set up to be, it's all about us, we can have whatever we want. It was much more of a, let's work and be part of what is there. So it was set up in as honourable way as you can when you're coming into a country to take land. However, I might come into America now and say, I really don't like the fact you're wearing your feathered headdress. I find it really offensive to me. So, what happened was that the women there were naked. I think the Hopkins were known for making people put their clothes on, keep their clothes on, go and wash in their clothes. I remember picking up something somewhere that you like to wear your clothes, but it is really uncomfortable, covered in these heavy gowns, and it's much more appropriate to be very limited in what you wore. And actually, the Indian community wore very little. Hopkins family wore a lot. And so I think there was a lot of forced acculturation, saying this is the way we do things, so you have to do it our way. So having left a country where they were angry about being told what to do, they then took that and enforced it on America, on the people there.
I see. Well, that makes sense, because my grandmother was like that. She wanted me to wear these weird clothes all the time. Family. She was all about this overdressing us all the time, and very strange. Like, it's hot out. Why do I need to wear this big thing? They were all about my family. It's funny. That's a tiny little.
So that's a little thread. There'll be lots of other threads. You're probably the sort of people who would go to the Cannes Film Festival and pop a baby out when you're launching your first movie. Right. So you're probably somebody who's fearless. That's why you're in this industry, because you're not frightened. You're not frightened of serial killers. You're not frightened because you were prepared to have a baby in the middle of the ocean.
Right. So you've already done it.
So
and
these things. Yes.
He was shipwrecked before the Mayflower Hopkins. He went the first time and spent a year in Bermuda shipwrecked. So yes. I think
so this is a fearless attribute which will have been passed down. It's not random that we've met, because I come up from a fearless family. You can shoot us, you can get the mafia, their gangs. I've had to deal with gangs in Sri Lanka, and I don't care. Go ahead and shoot me. I'd rather you shot me than I show fear. And actually, people who are monsters don't like it when you stand up against them. They literally move away.
This is very true.
So that's probably why you're doing what you're doing today, because you're not a serial killer, but you're happy to deal with them. And look where we are. You're happy to. And if you go back to the Mayflower, you may have found there were incidences in the community where your family stood up and said that's not right, and took on families that thought it was okay to steal or to not follow the compact.
Yeah, what we know about the Hopkins line. So Elizabeth Hopkins, the amount of women there were only 4, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 surviving women, and then there were the teenage girls. So one was like 17 up down to 13, and then there was the children. The
You know, there
only
were 28
those,
females who came. You did know that
yeah,
28 women came over,
yeah,
and
yeah, and
74
then
males. I wasn't sure if you.
about the ones that survived. So it was like of the women though, I think four survived. Four women, right? I have to look at my chart. And then some were
Yes,
children and teenagers. But they would have had to take care of everybody at that point, including the teenage girls, not the children. Would have had to tend to all the males' needs, all of the children. So there's
there were
trauma right
30
there.
children. They
Yeah,
were managing 30 children.
yeah.
Um,
Quite a bit.
Well, actually, interestingly, did you know the Wampanoags were mainly run, they're women with the chiefs as well as men. So actually, I think what's quite interesting, because they worked with the communities that were there, was actually there would have been a massive mind shift, because they didn't understand why they wore these heavy clothes. I'm going back to the heavy clothes. They thought they were crazy. How can you possibly work in this heat? Or, because now we're going into summer after having a freezing cold winter. So I think what is interesting to me is that there were 30 children for surviving women. I think I thought there were 5, but I'd have to check.
There
And
was one,
yeah,
but
it
then
must.
she died. She died that
Yeah. So
May.
right. Yeah. So after the winter was passing. Yeah. So what is interesting is that they would have been presented with two totally different cultures, of which women are now in charge. Because in America, ironically, there were as many women chiefs as male chiefs, because their culture, I think, was much more evolved than ours was. So yeah, it would have
Yeah.
been a massive shift for them.
So looking at the Fuller family, because they have the most connected to them, what was the background of them? Why did they leave the UK? And what was their role on the Mayflower?
So the Fuller family also signed the compact. They were the sort of the deacon, doctor, diplomatic, kind of well-educated. We're talking about the Fullers being sort of, for them, they didn't like the harsh situations they were living under. So to give you an idea of England and what it was like at the time, because Henry VIII had moved himself from being part of the Pope and everything, suddenly, if you did not obey what you were told to do, you were constantly in trouble. So I think with this particular family, they decided they didn't want to. They didn't want to be in England. Samuel, who's not to be confused with his uncle, he was also on the Mayflower, and he was the colony's doctor. It must have been very hard to do work, be a surgeon at that time. I certainly wouldn't have, there was nothing like we have now, like anesthetics. They would have used tools that would be quite blunt. You probably give them some gin or some toddy or whatever to get them, and then do these operations, which must have been very, very grim. You just clean up a slab and then operate on the person. I don't really know much more about the Fuller family. Samuel and Edward both signed the compact, so there were 2 more of the 41. The brother and sister-in-law perished, so that must have been quite traumatic in the harsh winter. And also one of their servants, so they all brought servants with them, believe it or not, which I found quite amazing. I think there was something like 30 servants on board, so it's a real mixture of people on board. Not only were there the separatists, there was there were servants, there were merchant adventurers making money out of it. Actually, they didn't make money. They spent 7,000 and they only recouped 1,600. I just thought I'd let you know that. So it wasn't a very successful financial trip from that perspective. And it had crew, and the crew were hugely diverse as well. And the Mayflower itself came back with the same person who sailed it over, and then it was just left languishing on the Thames. But yes, going back to the Fuller family, that's what I know about them. But I could find out more. Now you've now told me what your project is. I can certainly look into more of what their history was here and why they went.
I'm curious also to see, like, what were some of the theories and things that you came up with in your book? Like, where did your research lead you? I mean, that's a big project?
Okay, so our book was looking at the 400 years. So we looked at the history of the Mayflower. We also did something quite radical. We came over to America and we interviewed the Wampanoags. And actually, one of my favorite quotes is by the woman who was under Obama, and she said the Mayflower was an extraordinary thing. So she's the head of the Equina tribal group. And she said, from the English side, the colonial side, it was a tremendous thing. The people were intrepid, they were brave, they were bold, they were adventurous, they endured incredible hardships, overcame challenges unlike any other community before them. They were able to grow and build for themselves with our assistance, of course. What you see today, it could and should be celebrated from that perspective. However, the Wampanoag, the Indian side, it was devastating because that which was built on our backs, on our lands, with our resources, using germ warfare, early forms of concentration camps, with forced acculturation, forced Christianity, forced disposition of our lands, our traditions, our language, our culture, our speech, and our dresses, essentially our identity. So very interesting, both sides, very intrepid, very brave. But the flip side is they reduce these people to nothing almost. I mean, actually, I think it ended up being 6 million from some huge number because of the Great Dying, which was between, I think, 1616 and 1619. So, to me, the story that we do with this book is we look at it from what happened to the people in situ when we arrived. So we went over there and asked them. We went over to Holland to ask what was going on with the people who initially they ran off to Holland, which is why you have the Speedwell boat. So had a lot of people come to Plymouth in the UK that were going to join forces. 2 boats were going to go, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but the Speedwell had a leaking boat, was a problem. That's why they kept delaying their trip. So what we did was we followed the separatists from Holland where they'd left. Why did they come back? Why did they then get on the Mayflower? And then we followed the journey over to America. We looked at what they felt about the arrival. And then we looked at what happened as a result. Because, I mean, also, besides serial killers, a number of people who were on the boat have also become movie stars, quite famous ones, and also presidents. So it was, it's really interesting. You've got people who went on to do incredible things for the country, and then people also did really awful things. So we followed the journey, which you can see in the book, of what happened, and then how life has changed. So we looked at what it was like 400 years ago for a fuller. What was it like to be a shoemaker then? What is it like to be doing that today, and what will it be like in 400 years time? And we looked at each of the professions on the boats and what it was like to be a soldier, what it was like to be a Lord Mayor or a governor, which is one of them took on the role of being governor. And then we looked at what it's like will be like in the future. We actually asked them, what do you think it'll be like 400 years from now? So we not only followed the journey from all perspectives to give a fair view of it, but we also looked at what will it be like 400 years from now in each of those professions. And some of these professions don't even exist today. For example, we don't have anyone being a cooper, making barrels, unless it's for a fun restaurant, and we don't have anybody who's a fustian. So some of these jobs today don't exist. What jobs will exist in the future?
When you went to Holland, what did you find out about what they were doing there? I mean, we've heard different stories about the whole Liege congregation, so I'm just curious what your perspective is.
I think that they went to Holland, I think, to get freedom, and I think what they found was that the Europe that they were expecting it to be, the country Netherlands as they called them, it wasn't what they were expecting. So I think that, and you had split groups also, because some of them stayed. There were some people who didn't come back to the UK. I don't know if you're aware of that, but the ones who did, some of them stayed there. They were happy to. I guess the people who went over there were happy to become like the Dutch, and those who left, it was because they were so not happy with. I mean, simple things like willing land. So what I think is interesting is those who went to America and still had land here could still own their land. And this is really interesting. But in Holland, they couldn't do that. So if you're young and you're going to a new country, because essentially it was a new country for them, as you get older, you start to think, well, I would like my farm that I left because I didn't agree with the religious situation, I didn't believe with the way they were telling us what to do, or the poverty or whatever. You start to think, I would like to have that farm. I'd like to give it to my family, but they couldn't do it from Holland. And this was another thing. If you were in a financial position, you wanted to make sure you didn't lose it. But going to America, they continue to own it and could hand it on to members of their family. So these are small things, but they were reasons for them not wanting to stay on in Holland. They became dissatisfied with it. So what have you heard? What have you discussed about?
Well, just
Holland?
that they went to Holland because they were looking for religious freedom. They wanted to be able to print whatever they wanted. They wanted freedom of speech. I mean, we all know Holland from the beginning always was about, human rights, freedom to be whatever you want, whoever you want. And I just feel like the persecution that was happening in the UK was pushing them over there. But we just didn't really get a full answer as to why they decided to just leave and go to America. It was just, what you're saying is interesting. They couldn't buy land. They couldn't have their own land there. That makes sense.
It wasn't so free. I think the freedom of speech thing is a bit of a sort of, I think we like to think freedom of speech. I'm sure in America people like,
you used to have freedom of speech here.
Yes, exactly. So I think that Britain was not giving freedom of speech, and it wasn't even allowing you to leave. You had to get permission to leave England. Did you know that? You could just get on this
I did.
boat.
I mean, when I was surprised by a lot of the rules in the UK. When I moved there, I was like, there's all these rules. I'm like, we really need to do like an American to British dictionary, because there's a lot of rules that you guys have that we don't have, that people don't realize. Do
you know where the word passport comes from?
No.
Because it's because you're passing the ports. They need to know who you are, where you're going, because you couldn't leave. I mean, you could get on a boat in Europe and leave, but here you have to say, you have to get permission to leave, and that's where you're passing the port. That's where the word passport comes from, to get permission to leave. And it was illegal if you didn't get permission and they caught you, they could put you in prison.
Oh my goodness.
So you could just pop over to France because you liked it, as you did when you were here. So you had to, and you would have had to use your passport, but that's where it was. So very controlling. Britain was not only controlling of speech, controlling of your religion. You don't agree with what's happened. You don't want to go to that church. You didn't go to that church the first Sunday, you were told off. The second Sunday you were fined, and the third one you were arrested. So incredibly restrictive. And that's why they went to Holland expecting it to be free. They weren't fined in Holland, but the freedom of speech, the things that they thought, I think that they felt that it wasn't, and the way they lived their lives was different. So you talk about, you go to Holland and you see that they weren't the same. They were very different, and they tried. I went to their houses. I went to there's a lovely house that's a pilgrim house, which the separatists lived in, very near the church. And they what I would call a cupboard they slept in. I mean, that was the other. I was like, oh my goodness, did they really sleep in that? I've got a small area over here, thinking, how could you actually sleep a person in that area? They did, so they weren't living in lovely big beds and 4 posters, the image that we get in Bridgerton. They were living in very confined box spaces. So actually another reason would, I think, going to America would be to have space. And I think that's what everybody always talks about, America, the space. And Britain obviously was colonizing. I mean, we didn't use that word then, because they had run out of space. Hence the merchant adventures.
In your research, did you come across anything regarding any of the Mayflower passengers being Jesuits, members of the Jesuit order, or Rosicrucians or Knights Templar? Any connections to that? Do you know?
I think there were Knights Templars on there. I've never been asked to look at that, but I certainly could find out for you. No, they, when they use the word, and I think, sorry?
Especially Isaac Allerton. I don't know for sure. I just feel like that there's a connection.
But it has been. There were letters and things where it came up, but no one has actually, because obviously people didn't think it was important. And that's why I think this is an interesting discussion, because I can go away and look further into that question. But I didn't hear about any Jesuits. Now, did you have anybody that you've come across that was a Jesuit? Because that's certainly...
Just that it's a direction that I feel that there is a connection to some types of pre-Masonic orders, Jesuits, Knights Templar, Rosicrucians. Also, with Isaac Allerton's wife being a Norris, it is not 100% confirmed on her father. They say they don't know who he was, but Sir Edward Norris was a knight. There's the whole Oak Island thing. Well, I know that it was a storm that caused them to land where they did, but it is a direct line to Oak Island. We already know Knights Templar were on Oak Island. So I feel like there might be some kind of a connection there.
I think you're right. I think there is more. That's why I'm very interested, because the Middle Temple was Knights Templar. And when I went, because my dad was a member of the Middle Temple, I think the Knights Templars have a lot more that's never been looked at. And I think that is definitely worth investigating. It just wasn't something we weren't looking at people going, you know, looking at people from the perspective you're looking at is quite different from what we were doing, which is why did they leave? What was driving them? What were the different views? Welcomed in America, which we weren't, which is a story that we were always told, that we were this great boat that sailed over there. Everybody was really happy. We signed this compact, but actually, you know, it very quickly fell apart. And actually, the person they actually made the compact, they agreed to have these peace treaties with. They even took the grandson as a slave. So things weren't this pretty picture that we've been presented. It was much more complex. So I think the Knights Templars is another very interesting thing to look at. I also think the banks, that with both the Plymouth and the London Bank, they definitely in 1605 were planning to use finance to clear using germ warfare. That we definitely know from our research, and that more research should be done on that.
Also interesting to note that the Moore line, I know there were the 4 Moore children. There's something up with the Moore children. Now, they're supposed to be the only ones with proven royal lineage, 11th great grandfather being a king. 3 of the children died the first winter.
Yeah.
Only the one boy survived. He does have descendants, but if you look, 0 serial killers, 0 presidents, 0 celebrities descend from him, which I think is very interesting. So there's also something very interesting about the Moore line.
That's the thing. It's like that one family doesn't have any of these ties, but yet
no celebrities, no presidents, no nothing, and they do have descendants.
Yeah. I think it'd be really interesting to take each, because you've presented it as to me. You see, we looked at it as, what did they do? Why did they go? But actually, what happened to them, and what was it that when they went? You know, that's the cause and effect. So, you know, we looked at Didgeridoo Priest was a hatter. Thomas Rogers was a camlet maker. You know, Miles was a soldier. Miles Standish. So we were looking at it from, what did they do? Who were they? Were they separatists? Were they merchant adventurers? Were they crew? And then, but what then happened to them? You know, yes, we talked about the celebrity ones, but we didn't go into detail with what happened to the other lines in there. And I think actually it would be very interesting to know, you know, being a wool carder. I mean, one of the families, William White. I mean, who are the serial killers? Is this the ones here? Is it Fuller?
Yeah, Fuller is John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer. What?
So there's a second page to this. This is some of them. There's a lot of killers and a lot of Mayflower passengers. But some of the lines,
Brewster and Bradford surprises me, because we haven't really talked about Brewster and Bradford, but Bradford became the governor. He was a cataloger. He was a writer. He wrote the book, The Plymouth Plantation, which was a detailed view of their successes and failures. I'm very surprised, as somebody who was a negotiator, deeply religious, really wanted to make the compact work, also make sure that they worked well with the community. I was very surprised that he has got killers in the family, because he was a very well-educated person. And also Brewster's family.
I believe it was Bradford, Cindy, right? That there was researchers that had shown that he had a meeting with some sort of a Knights Templar, went in, possibly stole something right before boarding the Mayflower. but he had a meeting with such a temple before coming. I think it was him or Brewster. I think it was Bradford, the one who became
Because
governor. I think that was.
so Bradford, what's interesting was that he was often negotiating things. He was the sort of negotiator in the team. So it's entirely possible that when they were in Plymouth, because they stayed in what is now the gin distillery. I think it might have been a monastery at the time, and people did meet them before they got on the boat to leave. So it's entirely possible that they did meet the Templars there. I mean, I think that's worth pursuing. But to me, he was a kind of really good guy in this. So that to find out he's a serial killer is kind of a bit worrying, because you think education would trump serial killing. But if you go back to my thing about the Plymouth and the London Company, their intention was to clear the land. Is that not genocide? Is that not genocide to go to an island? I mean, it's a very big country, but the intention was to use smallpox blankets, and they didn't really know what it was, and it could be random. It could be that a ship arrived with rats on it. This spread across like wildfire. They didn't have any pandemic things that we all had to socially distance. But it is very odd that in 1605 they were talking about clearing a country to colonize it. And it's less than 10 years later, in 1616, there were 3 years of the great dying, of all these people dying. And if that was their intention, genocide, because it was genocide of, if that is what, and that's what the Indians believe it was genocide, that we came in and we murdered them. That's what they believe. And I think it's worth interviewing about them. If that is the case, and every single one on that boat is guilty of being party to it, that's a hell of a lot of guilt. And for me, that would be grounds for pursuing and becoming a serial murderer later on, because that's a lot of family guilt karmatically. I would have thought that was massive. If you knew that this is what we don't know what they know. I don't want to say that they all knew this, but they must have known a certain amount. Who was paying for the trip? Who paid for their journey across there?
This is interesting about the Bradford line. A commenter on one of my TikToks had said, nothing but wealthy people descend from the Bradford line. And I looked it up. He's not correct. He was saying that the people that he knew that were on that Bradford line were very wealthy. Hugh Hefner descends from the Bradford line, as well as J.P. Morgan Jr., the founder of the J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. And then there was another super duper wealthy, like obscene amounts of money type of wealthy, who I couldn't think of right now. So I thought that was very interesting.
It's a circle, isn't it? Banking. They banked on a group of people as a Trojan horse. They cleared before they got. How do you go to a country which is already called Plymouth, from Plymouth, and you're blown off course? How does that happen? I mean, I'm not having any conspiracy theories here, but it's a little odd to me. You arrive in a place, you're blown off course, and it's called that. How does that happen?
Well, when you do research, you see the patterns, and you notice, you're like, that's why we're digging into this, saying, well, what is up with these certain Mayflower passengers? And one of them, I believe it's Billington, supposed to be America's first recorded murderer. However, he only has one serial killer attachment. That serial killer also has many of the other descents from the other passengers. He was the one who did not like what they were doing. He was like, no, I'm not into this. I personally think he was framed for murder. I think he was probably more self-defense. And I think he was a good guy. I think that's a good line. Because just by pure happenstance,
that often happens. You deflect so that you can cover up what other people are doing. You throw something as a sideline when people are doing bad things. So he probably was a good guy. I've seen so many times, even in situations, covering wars and stuff. People deflect. So you're looking over here when you should be looking here.
Yeah, that happens quite a bit. Yes, especially in politics and in crimes and everything else. So they want to create chaos over here, so you're not paying attention to what's really going on.
I mean, my father did a very interesting trial where this guy was a I'm going to use color. I don't normally use color, but he was a black guy. It was in the 60s, and he was accused of murdering this woman, the wife of this husband, who was very distressed. And the thing is, he had no access to the house because in those days you'd just let them in the garden. She was murdered on the second floor. They didn't have a ladder. My dad went to the scene. And he was like, wow, this guy can jump high. How did he get in? Must have borrowed a ladder from the street, went up and down the street, couldn't find a ladder. I asked people if they'd ever seen a ladder there. No. And he asked in court, he said, he said, did you give keys to your gardener? No, of course not. It was ridiculous. And then he said, well, do you have a ladder? Does it fold up? No, absolutely not. And of course, then he was like, wow, this guy is amazing. He jumped up, got it there. No reason at all to murder this woman. Right. And we are all assuming he's guilty because of the color of his skin. And of course, it wasn't him. It was the husband. And two such small things. But the distraction is the gardener. He would have been able to do that. But he didn't think about that you would ask the question: does he have keys? Because the audience have already thought he's guilty. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So it's those small things that you have to do. And when you're looking at, I mean, it's Cindy and you both are looking at crime and stuff. I think that you start to see there are things that people do in politics to distract you from what is a real thing that what they want to push through.
Exactly. So going back to the families, who else do we speak of here? Hold on one second.
Bruce, the Brewster family was
yes.
was also another one. He was a separatist leader, teacher. He worked as the Queen's secretary. He negotiated with Spain, believe it or not. He had 4 islands named after him, even a chair. He again was well educated. By virtue of his education, he was considered an important guy. So he might have been very wealthy, going back to the wealthy thing. But he was a Puritan separatist. He organised to leave England. I think he was one of the few people who didn't get the sort of full permission at the time, but I'd have to check that. So I think he slightly broke the law when he was leaving, but I would have to check.
Has wealth on it. The descendants are wealthy. I've heard his line has wealthy descendants as well.
Yeah. So yes, there was money and education there, and obviously they were involved with royalty. If you're going to go and negotiate with Spain, you are going to have that by royal decree. You're not just going to pop over there because the royal family was much more important than the government in those times. And we were in very different times now. The royal family are much more of a figurehead, and the governments are the people who, maybe not the governments, maybe the multinationals and the people who fund the governments, but nevertheless, they are more the people who would decide what would happen. So that's
the Knights of Templar issue has been kind of haunting us to kind of figure out if there was a connection. I mean, I think it's interesting what you're saying too, that they were coming over to clear the land. Really, that was the main objective, which no one really discussed. We've never discussed that in our history. No one ever talks about that.
No, it was this lovely, sweet boat that arrived with lovely bunch of kids and children, the perfect Trojan horse.
Right.
And I also learned your history, and that's what I learned in history. And I was shocked because the more I dug, the more I asked people. And when I went to meet the Wampanoags, I was deeply shocked. And but also why the Wampanoags not doing. Yes.
You had a theory, you said initially when we started, about the merchant adventurers, because I got a theory on that one too, about why they came over. What did you come up with? What was your idea about why they would send people?
Well, because they had sent people previously, other boats have come. We never talk about the other boats, but other boats must have come because you can't have it both ways. It's the first boat to come, which is how it's represented. Because how did these other boats arrive with rat-infested whatever that cleared the land for 3 years? I mean, that's a boat has to arrive for that to happen, if that's the theory. Other boats had gone. We know that other people had gone to America and had been driven back. So they knew that they couldn't get in there And this is why I think they sat down and thought, what do we do? How do we change this game? We're sending people over, and we're not getting anywhere. These are very strong people. They know what they're doing. What do we do? And that's where I think they came up. And pandemics have been used. If you see, there's old drawings where they've used catapults and catapulted, blankets and clothing with smallpox on into a fortress where people have picked them up, and of course then it moves. And they've known about that for hundreds of years, long before what happened in America. They knew about that. So that's what I think. I think they deliberately. I think they planned it, and they maybe the people who went on the boat didn't all know. I'm not saying all the separatists. They were leaving because they wanted to have the freedom to be able to worship in the way they wanted. I don't believe they were all in on it. I think, in fact, they had been all in. It would been a bit of a disaster. I think they didn't know. That's what I think.
Well, I mean, I do know that Stephen Hopkins, my relative, had come over before the Mayflower, and he had been shipwrecked in Bermuda for a year. So, I mean, he was a merchant also, independent of shoemaking, but he was also a trader and a merchant. So he had come over originally because my grandmother had always said, our people came before the Mayflower, and we were like, what are you talking about? And then he started.
She's right.
He was right. Yes, she was right. So
but that's not what's written in the history books. That is not what we're told.
Right. I mean, he went over before a year before, a couple years before, and survived a massive storm and lived in Bermuda shipwrecked for like literally almost a year. And he was recruited to go on to the Mayflower because of that experience. But I do think that there's some interesting ties with maybe this whole merchant, the money, follow the money. They always say follow the money. Like, what exactly was the root of why they were sending people over here? Like you're saying, it was the perfect Trojan horse. You have this happy little shiny.
£7,000 was an absolute fortune. Absolute. Right. Why did they put so much? And we'd have to translate what that would have been 400 years ago. 403 years, 4 years ago. 404 years ago.
Merchant adventurers. So the merchant adventurers, the one guy who recruited the Pilgrims, Puritans from Holland, was what was his guild? Ironmonger. He was a member of the Ironmongers Union. And I noticed there's some correlation. Those are similar pre-Masonic type of royal decree trade unions. So there's something interesting there.
In London. There are guilds in London of these different printing, shoemaking, Ironmongers Hall. They are all still operating, and people are members of them, and they are very powerful. Part of the City Corporation of London.
And these are the people that were money guys, the members of the merchant adventurers. And I think that they were aware of, because if they're in such a guild, there's probably ties to the Knights Templar, and knew of, people chasing the Oak Island. Now, some of them had come over not on the Mayflower, some of the merchant adventurers, because some Mayflower passengers ended up marrying into those lines. So some serial killers have that. And I'm thinking, because of I know they were blown off course, but the fact that they settled a very direct line to Oak Island, and we know in the 1500s there were Knights Templar leaving treasure because they've now dug up and found all that stuff. That there was fighting going on. There was, so I think that some of their motivation might have something to do with that treasure.
Yes, I think, they always say follow the money. I mean, if the Mayflower came in with the good intentions that we're led to believe, why was it? And I remember thinking this is a lovely way of describing it. Warships followed like waves on the ocean, one after the other. So if your intention is to have a good interview with me, we hope it's going to be a good interview, and then you sabotage me next week. Your intention was never to have a good interview with me; it was to use me as a fall guy. So if their intention was good, they would surely have followed with more ships wanting to be part of this great country. But they didn't. They followed with warships, and they were very, very determined. I mean, that treaty fell apart very quickly from 1621 when they signed it with the Indians. By 1675, it was completely over. It was ripped to pieces. It was in shreds. So the intention that we're made to think clearly wasn't the intention. Otherwise, the next lot of votes, the people would be equally wanting to be part of the community and develop a really good, I mean, I don't know, I don't understand myself. Why can't we work together and learn from each other? We wiped out a very sophisticated society that knew everything about growing, that knew everything about the environment, and it was so important. Why did we do that? They've been there,
I don't know.
25,000 years. I mean, some phenomenal amount of time those people had evolved. And I'll tell you a very, very simple fact that I found fascinating. For every 2 people, the Wampanoags could feed from 1 acre. Okay, we need 10 acres to feed 1 person. That was the level. I'm just giving you one snippet of how much cleverer they were than we were. And at the end of the day, we have to eat. The most fundamental thing is we have to eat. And they knew how to store their grain. They knew how to grow at the right time. They knew how to work with it, with all the different elements. We didn't, which is why half the people died.
Can you tell me, did you hear anything about an excavation was done of the Plymouth area where they found the graves of the settlers, and there were carvings on the bones, suggesting that there was possible cannibalism. Did you hear anything about that?
Yes, I did hear about that, and I heard that from the Wampanoags themselves saying, but I haven't seen them, but I think my brother's an archaeologist at the British Museum. I certainly could ask. He does tours and things. I could ask him more about that because I was intrigued by that. But I think cannibalism was much more normal in Sri Lanka, for example. They didn't have any cannibals in Sri Lanka until colonized people came over, and they felt it was the slaves that brought from Africa. I'm not saying that they were particular cannibals, but things changed when people came to Sri Lanka because they apparently, you can see in your feces, you can see if there's human bones in it, and so there was nothing there previous to 400 years ago. So that, to me, it doesn't seem odd that cannibalism was going on, bearing in mind they weren't very good at, they didn't know how to grow things. And I guess if you get very hungry and more people are dying, then I guess we've seen this in plane crashes in very remote places. You will eat the people, won't you? I mean, I guess that's what happens. So it might be that the actual people there found it very difficult, and then they did eat people. But I think there was cannibalism, but I was cannibalism elsewhere as well.
The Fuller brothers, their father was a butcher, so that was interesting. And then we have the son who's a doctor. So and there's like carvings on it. I know that the one, Edward, died and his wife died, and Samuel didn't die. I'm just saying, you may need to learn some skills from your papa, and maybe you were the one, serving the dish of, it might explain why some of those generational curses, like literally the Bible says, don't drink the lifeblood, says not to eat people. So if you were doing that, you might be ingesting some demons that would travel along in the bloodlines.
I think that is really interesting because butcher's knives, you do know how to cut up a person.
And if you're the sons of a butcher and you're a doctor, it kind of goes together.
Yeah, well, actually, yes, because it was not so dissimilar cutting up a human being. I mean, the kinds of reading about what they did for people who had a leg or a septic arm, and it was horrific. You might as well have been a piece of meat. I mean, it was very. And if you survived, it was extraordinary. And the instruments were incredibly blunt, and I would not have liked to be giving birth in those days. I think the women were obviously incredibly tough. As I say, the one at sea, I just can't believe that your family can give birth in the middle of an ocean where there's no windows, no bathroom, no water except salt, and the only thing you can drink is sort of alcohol because that's the way they kept what water they had. You can't really call it water, really. It was just alcohol.
Yeah, it's very interesting, all of it. I mean, we've been given the sanitized version of this entire journey since we were born, and then
But
to come across.
do you think
Go
they've
ahead.
done that to cover it up? Do you think that's why it's so sanitized? Because other history isn't sanitized. We don't talk about the Second World War in a sanitized way. Was it
Correct.
because what we were just was so horrific that we had to cover it and pretend it was this lovely fairy tale story? Because it's told as a fairy tale. I was told it as a fairy tale at school.
Hmm.
Well, the roots of
Possibly.
those fairy tales are absolutely horrific. So it makes sense.
Yeah, I think it, we all, when we started, but you asked me about the beginning, we started it with thinking it was a fairy tale story, 400 years on, looking at the anniversary. The more we looked, the more the grim details came out. And it's the first time anyone's talked about the cannibalism, but I was aware that somebody talked about it in the museum, that they found bones that suggested that, but I didn't pursue that again because I wasn't looking at serial killers and patterns afterwards. But actually
Well,
now I'm really intrigued. I want to go and look further at these families.
there's
Yeah.
something interesting. I mean, there's all these threads. We're not really sure, like, why this cluster of serial killers are all related to these specific families. It's just bizarre. It's a bizarre pattern.
Do you know what? So my father would say, besides them being related to these families, are there any other connections with these serial killers? Because there'll be rats. So what are they?
There are families. I have certain groups of families that have high amounts. So it's not just the Mayflower. There's a few more families that also settled in Massachusetts that came later that have like 10 serial killers, another 10, like the Pierce line, the Kimball line. So I'm looking at that as a whole. And the serial killers are going to have multiple of these lines. Some of them are related to 3 or 4 of these heavy killer lines that I guarantee have generational curses attached to them. And I do believe I figured it out what the connection is. But so what I look at is I think on the Fuller line, most of the serial killers on the Fuller line are possession killers. They're my brother told me what it was.
Yeah.
Here,
He's
so we're
into
looking at here. We're looking at the different lines, right? So Gacy is on the Fuller line. He's also on the Priest line. He's also on my line, the Hopkins line.
you see,
That's John Wayne
how
Gacy. They
Mhm.
have there's different patterns, right, for these killers. These serial
Right.
killers all have different patterns and different ways of killing and different ways of taking their victims. And some of these patterns are lined up with the
The
relatives
ways
that
they
they have,
so
that the
Fuller
ones that
line
they're
is
connected to. So if you look at the
the
Fuller
Fuller
line, you have John Wayne Gacy, you have
Yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer, you have who's Thomas?
Lauren Douglas Thomas.
Lauren
So
Gacy.
He's
what
the
I'm
suspect.
I'm interested that the patterns will correlate in some way. They may even
Yeah,
correlate to the tools that were used, as butchers or as doctors. There will be some
right,
kind of correlation because
right.
what you've learned about patterns. So in my family, I expect everyone to be really positive. So even though my husband died a few years ago from a heart attack, we
Oh,
are a very positive family. I mean, yes, exactly. So but despite everything, most people would fall into a ditch and go, it's all over. Because I lived in Sri Lanka for a long time with the children. They grew up there and then they came here because I wasn't able to stay there to work. I mean, we go back as where our home is. But what is interesting is, that there are patterns. And so my family, they're very positive because our family's always been, well, we always look on the bright side. So not on this, obviously, it's not very bright, but we would find a solution. Perhaps we can stop the serial killers for the future through what you're going
well,
to
that's
tell
Right.
us.
why that was the interest in doing this, was to understand, because I work with another woman. She's a forensic criminologist. She's a serial killer whisperer. She speaks to serial killers and gets information about extracts information about missing victims that haven't been found yet, and trying to understand their brain patterns and why they do the things they do. So we were looking into these trees as potential ways of maybe understanding, is this a DNA thing? Is it just corrupted DNA that passes through? Is it DNA that could be corrupted by the way it's nurtured? Is there something that we can do in the future to prevent people from going into this dark world of serial killings? Because there's so many in the United States. You guys don't have as
And
many in the UK.
No.
but
But you've done some really terrible things, like you've banned you ban people to 90 meters marrying white people, marrying colored people. So there's an awful lot of trauma from these kind of very unpleasant laws. But I was going to say, I think that it's a mixture of things. I think elephants never forget. I think humans never forget, and that gets passed on in the DNA. So I think there's an element to that, and I think there's a lot of research on that. I also think patterns of behaviors are replicated. So being confident is a replicated pattern. If you see kids from confident, you can see the kids. If they're confident, you'll know the parents are. So those are replicated. But I also think that there are triggers. We are like a data board. So you might see a red rose and you might see it as love, but because of the way your family, you might be Hitchcock-esque and see it as it's that red rose that people die. And they see that. So I think there are triggers that are within us. That's why people get triggered for cancer. I mean, I think you could get a cure for cancer. You knew what the trigger was. Why do we have to trigger cancer? So I think it's a trigger. So I think it's a three-pronged thing. It's learned behaviors that carry on. I try to break friends' learned behaviors. I've got friends who are immensely talented because they were told they were useless by their family, never got education. They live with that belief. And I go, you're not. You're brilliant. You're really clever. Stop. But they find it very difficult to overturn that. In fact, I was talking to an artist just earlier who's one of the most brilliant artists I've ever worked with. But he truly believes he deserves to be in the trash cans of history. And that is because of his upbringing. It is ridiculous. He's so clever. He's so well read. He writes brilliantly. But he truly believes, because of his upbringing, that he's that. Okay? So you can have the nothing. Then you can have the people you meet who get you that chance, and then you can have the trigger points, and you can have memory. And I think that trauma is passed from one generation to the next. But what you do with that trauma is I think very interesting. Why do different children? One child is really good and goes out and does a great job. I mean, I know people who have been murderers. Dad covered cases where they've been murderers for generations, and suddenly someone becomes a doctor, which I think is kind of interesting. So instead of using the tools to murder, they become a doctor and they're a good guy, and they work in Harley Street, and they're really good people, and they kind of had to admit that their ancestors were all murderers. And it must be
that's what we're trying. We're kind of doing the reverse, right? So we're doing the reverse here. You have all these ancestors that were doing these amazing things. They were like adventurers, they were doctors, they were surgeons, they were tradesmen, they were coming to America as explorers and adventurers, and then the DNA breaks somewhere, somehow, some way, that flipped into this. That's what we're trying to understand.
So do you think if you arrived there, the area has been cleared of people? It's like a ghost town because there were buildings there as well. It wasn't that they arrived and had to build their own buildings and create everything from scratch, which is another impression you get. There was a sort of a town there existed. There were graves, as you said. They stole seed from the graves. So this was a fairly.
I heard that.
They stole the seed from the graves. They were grave robbers, and then pretended it was kind of okay, which is not.
Well, this is the thing too. If you study Native Americans and you understand their culture, I do a lot of work with the Chickasaw in Oklahoma and shamanic work with some other Native Americans that, to understand their culture. I mean, they're very in tune with the earth and with superstition and with the spirit, and much more than we ever were taught. Was there something? We read that they cursed the land, or the land was cursed, and they left, right? Did that happen? Was there any connection? I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I am curious.
That's a really good point. So if I tell you now, you two are amazing, and we leave this program, you're going to go, oh, I'm amazing. If I tell you two are conspiracy theories, no good, go away, how dare you do this, you're going to go away feeling really negative and thinking, we should abandon this program, not do it. So I think if you come and take somebody's land, or you take somebody's wife or husband, and you say, I hate this person, that you remember the negative. That's how curses work. It's not that, I'm cursing your project. I'm not. I think this is an amazing project. I'd love to be involved. But if you curse something, you immediately start to pull back from it. You don't put your energy into it, because humans are energy. So if you say
Yes.
this land is not going to work, and I have a good example. I have some land in Cornwall, which I bought because it was a rubbish dump. And in lockdown, I turned it into the most beautiful secret garden. It's not so secret now because you can see it from Google Earth. But I literally removed all the rubbish, healed it, and now the birds have gone back. And what I find very interesting is I didn't do it because I'm now working on this elephant project. I did it because I felt so upset the land was being poisoned, and I come from farming family, and so this clicked in. Something in the pandemic, I went, how can they dump rubbish there for decades? This is all these animals are dying. We're poisoning our food. It's seeping into the farming land, into the water. So I took it on myself to do that for no money.
So it's like,
I just did
yeah,
it.
you
But
did it. It was something within you.
something
Yeah.
came out of me. So that's why I'm saying these little buttons get pressed. And I
Genetic
guess
memory.
genetic memory. So if you came and stole my land, I wouldn't like you very much. I would want you to go to hell.
Right.
So if you feel that energy of negativity, that plays out, doesn't it?
Of course.
Genetic memory it's very real. I found a cousin of mine that nobody knew about who was given up for adoption. He's my uncle's son. He had a girlfriend. They broke up. She was pregnant. She didn't tell him. She gave the baby up for adoption. She was in art school at the time, and her parents said, "No, get rid of the baby. You got to focus on your career." She would later go on to work in a gallery, and she was an artist. When I found my cousin, I did not know who she was, and I was trying to figure out who his dad was, and I figured it out. And so the information came later. My cousin was an artist working in a gallery. He did the same bloody occupation as his biological mother that he never met. So it's in you. And
Of course.
it passes. Absolutely is, so that whole
And
nature versus
generational trauma too. I mean, I truly believe that, we are made up of energy and cells, and all of that stuff is transferred from one person to another when you're born. We're connected. We're all connected. That's the thing people don't realize.
We're all connected, and we're connected to our environment, and we make our environment. You might make a tipping point, and you can teach. That's why I'm really against people going through divorce cases and destroying their families and Why don't you just sit down nicely and think, okay, it didn't work, things don't work,
Right.
but we don't have to further destroy all those people, and then all the people around that, and the further people around that. We don't have to do that. And one of the things when my husband died is I wrote a book called The Foreign Wife, which I'm just about to finish. And what I realized was that actually my husband dying early was because of the enormous trauma in Sri Lanka of the JBP, how they set them on fire with, burning tires, and how he saw that as a small guy when he was a child. And then we went into war. And then, we obviously had children in the war. So my oldest was born in the war in Sri Lanka. And when he was born, he went through that trauma. Literally so he remembered these terrible images. I had no idea. I'd been married to him for years, and I'm going, what do you mean? Burning. I didn't know about this at all. So I think that you can trigger at different times. That's why psychologists say you should have help when you're a child, a teenager, getting married, your husband dies, because you change. And then as you change, different things can come into the mix. But I think negativity, the power of negativity, which is termed as curses or bitching, as I call it, because bitching can be just as bad, which is why I ban bitching. I'm not accepting any bitching from anyone. I literally am. If anyone people like to come and bitch to me about everyone, and I ban it. It's the most destructive force on the planet.
Truly.
And if we could stop that, we could evolve in a much more symbiotic way with the world. And
Absolutely.
I think that's the interesting thing. My father, he went into law. He studied English literature and drama. He wanted to change, and he left a lot of money to the Middle Temple for people from all backgrounds to study law. My mother also wanted change, and the two of them left a massive legacy, not just in their children, because we've chosen very unusual jobs, all of us, but in the fact they wanted everybody to have that opportunity to change and learn. And I think education does help. This is what you're going to do is educational, because it could stop serial killers. Yeah, why are there so many in America? Why are there so many suicides in Sri Lanka? Why? It's not natural. There's nothing natural about it.
No, we speak to them all the time. I mean, on our other show, it's horrendous what these victims go through. And Cindy was also able to connect. This is what was interesting. She was able to connect some of the victims, because my thing was always like, why do serial killers pick certain people and hone in on them and stalk them and find them and kill them, brutally kill these young girls? I mean, just horrific things.
Because
so she was able.
You have it written on you. You have it.
Well, she was able to connect some of the victims genealogy to the killers. So is that like a genetic connection? Are they recognizing their own DNA in these people and they want to destroy it because they're not, they're victims, they're innocents? Like, what is that?
Okay, I think it's really interesting. Just as you have learned behaviors that end up being a serial killer, I think they're learned behaviors to become a victim. And one of the things my father said is, you ever get hit by any guy, you walk and you never go back. I know women who just accept being hit.
Right.
And I'm like, what is going on here? This is ridiculous to accept this. So I think that that these things are written in your behavior, the way you speak, the way you sit, the way you put your shoulders back. People, when you walk in, I'm sure when you interview people for a job interview, you will pick up all sorts of things. And one of the doctors
I do, but when some of these victims are teenagers, 15, 14, 16 years old, it just seems to me there's something else. I don't know. He stalked this one girl, 15, beautiful girl, 15 years old. I mean, he's related to her. Now we find out that there's a connection in the genealogical tree to this victim. What is that about? I mean, it's just too random. The girl had a lovely family. We've spoken to the family. It wasn't like she was a victim of anything. She was only 15. So it's
have you brought together what would be a really interesting chat is lawyers, doctors, psychologists, because I think that you will find there are patterns, because I know the girls who were attacked at school, at university, I could see why. I wouldn't say that to them, but I could see their behaviors. Just as some of my friends go to me, Juliet, now nobody will marry you now because you're over 40. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. My grandmother was getting remarried in their 70s. So that won't be happening to me. There'll be queues. So I have no fear at all, unlike other people. But there are other people who at 40 haven't even been married. They're like, oh no, no one's, no, they're never married.
Well, you're creating your own destiny with that. Yes. I mean, you can create your own destiny with any thoughts you have in your mind. I mean, I have a friend who was 70. She's my agent in London. I put her on Match.com when I lived there because she broke up with her French boyfriend and she got married at 70 and she was married to him for 15 years. I mean, you can create your own destiny with your thoughts. People don't realize the power that they have.
So there are patterns. But yet very young people, there will be patterns. And I think this is what, if we can all understand our patterns, and I even with my children, I made them do counseling the moment their dad died. I made them do saying goodbye. I then made them do color therapy so they could see colors rather than red and get angry and red mist. And then I also got them to speak to a therapist. And again, as my son's now 16, I want him to speak to another person and have a mentor. Now, what has been said by the schools and even the college is your sons don't get up and take drugs, cause violence, cause trouble. Because why wouldn't they? It's very traumatic losing a father young. And a world which is pushing all the time, this all anesthetize, this is cool, they don't do that. And that's because they've been able to talk to somebody and say, this is what we're feeling. We're really angry. And he even said, could they do hypnotherapy to me? Now, hypnotherapy can be good or bad. But one of them said, if we do hypnotherapy, will we remember bad things about you, Mum? And I said, no, do hypnotherapy. Because I have nothing that I've done that I want to hide. And I think it's really interesting, the people who don't do counselling to get their children or themselves, because I also had to do therapy, because they said to me, Juliet, unless you change, how can the boys change?
Sure.
So that was also interesting. So we could go in and see the patterns of the girls.
But
we could
what
correct those
patterns, Cindy, did you find? Cindy found some patterns that
They're
There
working.
are patterns. There are not just patterns in serial killer trees. And that's what I recognize. When I build a person's tree out, I see patterns. A person that's a caregiver, I will find that they descend from a number of doctors, like someone who's a nurse or a doctor has at the end of the line, 400 years ago, a number of doctors. So they descend from that. My father-in-law was in the Navy doing their tree. He had a whole, and he didn't even know, descended from a bunch of admirals, captains, this type of a thing, people that were in the military. And as so with the serial killers, there are patterns. Now, the serial killer tree, there's a very specific pattern to the killers that descend from the Mayflower, the modern day killers, where they have recent either Nordic or Germanic. So we're talking Denmark, Switzerland, Germany, or like Norway, Sweden. So like these upper ones, just a very close connection to those areas. They also have a very recent European ancestor, or very recently out of the country, like within a couple of generations. And then they have those long lines that extend all the way to the Mayflower. They have the Mayflower connection. They all have a connection to Massachusetts. Even some of the killers that have a southern connection, who are from the south, it ends up going back up to the Mayflower. Most of the time, the Virginia colony settled the southern states. Your Massachusetts settled your upper states. But when there's crossover, and some of the killers, like including Charles Manson, descending from the Fuller line, like very, I mean, I understand that but it's a mental thing. Well, I noticed about, let's say, George Washington's grandfather, Lawrence Washington. If you go look on Famous Kin, you will see that is like the treasure trove of celebrity relations. That is very much a success line. And I know because a friend of mine who's a 6-time gold medalist Olympic, no, she was an Olympic gold medalist, and she was in the Olympics 6 times. She's on that line. I know, I see how that girl is. She's driven. She's very serious. So I can tell that specific line, the descendants are very, like
ambitious.
success driven. So I noticed the patterns in trees. But it was interesting that 100% of the Mayflower descendants that were heavy duty, did all the work, types of killers, like the big leaders of them, had the same pattern to the tree with the recent Europe, with that Germanic, Nordic connection. Some have both, with the Mayflower Puritan thing. So yeah, there's definitely patterns. And that was what caught my attention. I said, how come all of these trees look like almost identical? They all have a
Yeah.
very specific pattern.
Well,
So that was what caught me.
if they came over and they did know they'd committed genocide, how would you feel? And how long would that take to take that out? But also, we don't know what they did in those early years. We don't know what kind of bizarre behaviors, because there was no rules. I mean, as attractive it is to have no rules. I know they had the compact, but there was lots of things that weren't, there was nothing like we have the Constitution today. So people, when they have no rules, they can really, you find some people, I can go to any country in the world, I'm the same. But I have friends who go to other countries who suddenly do bizarre things. Their behaviors change. They change who they are. What
it's
the hell
so
is that
true.
about?
Expats. Oh my God, that is so true. I would have this group of friends. I lived in Europe for 8 years. I lived in London for 3 years. Either way, come to the States with these people, totally different. When I see them back home in London or in France, totally different. Like they're completely the opposite of what they are in America. And I'm like, what is that? You go to another country and you completely change. It's like they reinvent who they are. It's very strange. It's a lot of people have done. I've witnessed do that.
So maybe that's another thing that we don't really think about. Maybe we're moving parts, so we're very controlled on our environment. Take us out of our environment and we change all our moving parts. If you put a child with very positive people, they say this with trauma actually in wars. So if a child is being in a war zone, lost its parents, if they foster them with a very warm environment, those children will progress well. If they are left with families or relatives in that war environment, they do not progress well because the families are traumatized. the child is traumatized. Whereas if you remove somebody, I've always thought it was a bit cruel to remove somebody from one war zone, put them into England or France, because you're taking them out of their culture. But they have been surrounded by cotton wool and love. The people who've adopted them, they've been trained how to be parents. It's very, very, very difficult to foster or get a child in England. You have to go through full training, not that I had to as a parent, but these people do. And these children do really well. And so they followed them because they're traumatized and they've gone into this warm environment, and they could be 5, they could be 10. But surrounded by this, they then choose great people to be with and they flourish. So it is about your environment. So you suddenly go to America, do you suddenly become a bad guy? Do you suddenly become a party girl? Do you suddenly get morals? Do you suddenly, but obviously the group around you, the environment around you can change you. Not me, and not people who are sure in themselves like you guys, but I definitely feel that an environment can change you. And then if that carries on being the pattern, then that change stays, because maybe it was normal to go around murdering people, eating them. Maybe that was completely normal. They were hungry. There was no food. There was no seed. So you rob graves. I mean, grave robbers and cannibals. I mean, and there's nobody to tell you this is not okay. Maybe that became normalized, and that's why it's intergenerational. And we can't find the source document. We can't. That's why Ayurvedic doctors have to close the surgery when they have a killer or somebody dangerous and say, I can't do this. And they have to have a day of cleansing themselves of this energy because they can't find the source document. And that's what they've said to me. If we can't find what went wrong, we can't do anything about it.
Yeah. Well, Juliet, this is awesome. It's great to have you on. We'd love to have you on again after. Maybe we'll talk after and see if you're interested in looking into some other things for us, because I think you have a plethora of knowledge about all this stuff, which is quite interesting. I think that
go and look at more stuff. I'm going to go.
There's so much more to look at here.
I'm now going to be going into all these names, looking very closely at what patterns. Can I tell you one interesting thing is they didn't wear black clothing. And how do I know? Because they made detailed wills, which were all about passing on their very expensive, beautiful red purples. They were very brightly dressed. They weren't very black and white. So this is another myth with all the drawings, all black and white with their little hats. But they weren't, and they had these beautiful clothes that were passed from one generation. So do we pass things on through our clothes and what we wear?
Yeah. Right.
I don't know. It's very interesting. But thank you so much for coming on today. We'll speak to you again, I'm sure. And it's been a pleasure, Juliet. Thank you.
Lovely to meet both of you. Best of luck with the project.
Thanks.